Well, hello everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives, and welcome back, Harley Schlanger, for a bi-weekly get-together that you've been kind enough to schedule with me for about 2 years now. And I just really love our conversations, I have to tell you. Well, it's been a very, very intense and busy 2 weeks since we last talked. And I think the first thing that I'd like to do, since so much revolves around this question that many people are asking about Vladimir Putin. You'll see opinions that, oh, he's just part of the deep state and he's playing a role, to he's really is for the sovereign rights of Mother Russia and is, being grossly maligned in the press. Well, you've been studying this situation for some time, and I wonder if you wouldn't mind to just kind of open up the discussion with who, from your point of view, is Vladimir Putin?
Well, it's interesting because you mentioned one of the narratives, which is that he's from the World Economic Forum, that he's part of the whole deal of the Great Reset and so on, which makes no sense. But then you also have the hardline neoconservatives who say he's KGB, he's still a communist, he's part of a communist insurgency. And what they miss is that sometimes people grow up in a system where, in order to succeed in the system, you have to go along to get along. And in a certain sense, that's what Putin did. And Putin came from a tough background. His father suffered terribly during World War II. His mother and father had a child who died during the siege of Leningrad. Putin was somewhat of a juvenile delinquent when he was younger, by his own admission, until he took up judo. And he learned something about fighting and also about self-development. But what people miss is that someone could have been a loyal Russian figure in the service of the KGB in the 80s, and then watch that system collapse and adapt himself to a new system. And importantly, they quote Putin, who said the collapse of the Soviet Union is one of the great tragedies of our time. So they say, well, what he means by that is he wants to restore the Soviet Union. No, actually, what he means by that was described very beautifully by a friend of mine who did an interview with me yesterday for my update, Alex Kreiner, a Croatian financial analyst and author who wrote the book behind me, The Grand Deception, about Bill Browder. And what Alex writes about, and this is the same thing that Sergei Glaziev writes about, that a number of people have written about, is the shock therapy policy that destroyed Russia in the 90s under Yeltsin. And the person steering this from the United States was Al Gore. It was the Gore-Chernomyrdin Commission. And Gore was working directly with Boston, Wall Street, and London bankers to grab as much as they could of the wealth of the former Soviet Union after the collapse. They were the ones who told Yeltsin who to give money to, and that's where the so-called oligarchs came from. But a huge amount of money was just siphoned off from the West. And the death rate in Russia grew so rapidly, the life expectancy fell so quickly, that Russia was experiencing within 5 years a dramatic demographic crisis. The numbers of deaths exceeded the number of live births. And the country was becoming unlivable as chunks were being taken off by the West. And this is after the agreements were reached between Russia and by Yeltsin and the West, including George H.W. Bush, Thatcher, Mitterrand. They all basically said, oh, no, we'll bring you in as a partner. And then they sent their vultures there to pick the bones clean of the Soviet Union. They stole the mineral wealth, the oil wealth, and so on. By 1999, there was a grouping in Russia of Russian patriots who said no more. And they were the ones who brought Putin in. Now, it took him a few years to get his feet on the ground, but Putin made the decision that he was going to defend the interests of Russia and the Russian people as a nationalist. Now, you would think that those in the West who believe in the idea of national sovereignty, that this would make him a hero. Because he was saying, we're a sovereign nation. You just can't come in here and steal our raw material wealth. Well, that's why Putin is a hero to many of the leaders in the Southern Hemisphere, because he stood up. And because Russia had nuclear weapons, even though they dismantled some of them, they lost a lot of land, a lot of their population. They lost the Warsaw Pact as their military allies. They gave that up. But Putin said, we're not going to give up our raw material wealth, and he cracked down on the oligarchs. And ironically, who came to the defense of the Russian oligarchs? The West, saying that Putin is corrupt. Bill Browder wrote a book where he said Putin is saying that he's not going to jail the oligarchs if they give him 50% of their wealth. Now, Browder was asked, do you have documentation of this? And he said, no, I have no evidence. I just believe that it's that. So you had this looting of Russia. And what my friend Alex Kreiner points out is that this shaped the mentality of what today is the Russian military general staff, the business community in Russia, the idea that they're not going to allow their country to be dragged into the gutter again. They're going to develop themselves, and they're going to do it, if necessary, without the West. Now, Putin kept talking about working with the Western partners, and Bill Clinton and Obama and Bush Jr. all talked about, well, we can work with you, we can work with you, even as they were trying to pull Georgia away, pull some territory like Chechnya away from Russia, even as though as they were trying to insist that, I think it was someone around Clinton said, Russia is a gas station with nuclear weapons. In other words, the profile of a third world country. But Putin said no, and he stood up for that. But he was not irrational about it. On the question of Ukraine, what he saw was that Ukraine was the next area for NATO to grab to move their weapons and their military forces to the border of Russia. And then when he saw after the 2014 coup, and it was a coup, it was orchestrated by networks in British intelligence and US intelligence. They trained the so-called democracy forces, including the narrative makers, the hybrid warfare makers. And then after the 2014 coup, which Victoria Nuland admitted cost the United States $5 billion. After that, they never stopped the Ukrainians from violating agreements they made with Russia to stop attacking the Russian ethnic population in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. From 2014 to 2022, there were 14,000 civilians killed in the Donbass. And these were Ukrainians of Russian origin. So the Ukrainians were killing their own population. But these were Ukrainians that said they didn't want to give up their connection to Russia. And they objected to the coup against Yanukovych because Yanukovych said, let's balance between Russia and the EU. Why do we have to choose one or the other? And that was the Ukrainian so-called democracy forces, who it turns out were a bunch of neo-Nazi supranationalists, ethnic cleansers to be more accurate. That's what the hardcore Ukrainian, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists is about. They're the people in World War II who worked with the Nazis to kill hundreds of thousands of Poles, Romanians, and Jews that lived in Ukraine. And now they were targeting the Russians. And so finally, Putin in February of this year said no more. They had an agreement. Ukraine signed an agreement. Poroshenko signed it. Zelensky reaffirmed it, that they would give limited autonomy to the people in the Donbass. Instead, they kept shelling them, kept shooting them, kept killing them. And so it was after pleading for years with the West to recognize that this was seen in Russia as a threat, that Putin took the action with a special military operation. Now, that's the story that my friend Alex told on my video update yesterday. It's a special edition, and if people are interested in it, it's really quite fascinating. It's the LaRouche Organization daily update with me. and you can download it, and it's a longer than usual update, but the story is really compelling. So that's one of the things I've been up to, because it's interesting now. In the last 24 to 48 hours, we're seeing some changes from the West. Nothing dramatic yet, but moving in a dramatic direction. Number one, the potential for the breakup of the German coalition, because the Greens went crazy when Olaf Scholz went to China with business leaders. Secondly, you have Scholz's leading lieutenant in the Bundestag, Rolf Mützenich, who identified the Committee to Combat Disinformation, the Ukrainian neo-Nazi terror threat against people they call information terrorists, like me. Mützenich is on that list, and he exposed it in the Bundestag, and the German press was forced to admit that it exists. And the Ukrainians are going nuts to say, no, 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 we don't want to kill anybody. We just don't like disinformation, which is completely different from what they were saying when they unveiled it back in July of this year. And then finally, there were reports on the BBC today that when Jake Sullivan went to meet with the Russians, as well as with Zelensky, he was advocating that now's the time to get negotiations going. Now, that would be very useful. I wonder if they're going to say Sullivan is an information terrorist for talking about negotiations. So there's a lot going on around the Ukraine situation, on top of which we have the US election. And I think Biden, from what we're told, is preparing to introduce a very large additional allocation to Ukraine of up to $50 billion, because he's afraid if the Republicans take the House, they won't give what the Republican leader in the House said would be a blank check. No more blank check. McCarthy said that. So they're trying to move the money through. But I pointed out something today that I think I'll just stop at this point. Here's Biden attacking his opponents in the Trump wing of the Republican Party as Nazis and extremists, and talking about how they threaten our democracy. Then he's giving $60 billion of weapons, and possibly $50 billion more, to people who openly identify as Nazis in the Ukrainian Defense Forces. So where's the consistency?
Well, those are good Nazis.
There are Nazis.
Yeah, yeah. Don't worry about those Nazis. Those are the good Nazis.
And it goes back, as you know, to the Dulles brothers.
Yeah.
And the rat line that Alan Dulles ran to protect Nazis after World War II.
Wow, the history is so amazing and so complex and so interwoven. And as our good friend David Underdown often says, the same names keep coming up, in different contexts, but it's often just the same players in a different ball game. And thank you for referring to Alex Kreiner's interview with you yesterday, which is on your daily updates, right?
Yeah, you
Yeah,
can find it there.
I definitely want to see that, because I know that you were referring to the shock doctrine, and while I have a general idea of it, I think it'd be a good idea for you to refresh me on what exactly that is. Where's the term come from, and why is it relevant to what you were saying about Russia?
Well, after the fall of communism, the question is, what are you going to do with Russia? It's a nuclear power. It's a country that has a skilled labor force. It has scientists, but it's also still poor because the Soviet system was not very good. Now, the Soviet system took care of the people who were the party members, and actually, Ukraine was one of the wealthier countries in Eastern Europe because it was a center of a lot of the Soviet military and heavy industry production. But it didn't work. So the question was, what are you going to do with Russia now? And Yeltsin was promised there would be support, there would be aid to enable them to make a transition to a market economy. Now, what happened is you had a group of economists like Anders Åslund, a Swedish pillager, like Bill Browder, who was an American who gave up his American citizenship because he didn't want to pay taxes in America. His grandfather, by the way, was Earl Browder, the head of the American Communist Party during World War II. Browder was one of these guys, but it also included people like Bob Strauss. You remember him, John, the Texas wheeler dealer, leading Democrat? He was appointed by Clinton to oversee the disbursement of Russian properties. He basically went in and bought up as much good real estate as he could. The American banks and the British banks went in, and they brought in the International Monetary Fund, and they brought in Jeffrey Sachs with them, who was known as an IMF fixer. Now, Sachs's proposal was that there be some credit given to Russia so that they can rebuild. But the rest of them were saying, no, to shift to a market economy, you have to destroy everything that's there. Dismantle it, take away their industry, take away their raw materials, privatize everything. And that's what led to a collapse in the standard of living. And they called it shock therapy. And it was a shock, all right. It increased the death rate. It demoralized the population. It was and this is what Putin says was the tragedy of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Not that he wants the Soviet Empire, but that the deal that was made, which could have brought Russia in as a partner in the West. Remember, there were promises that Russia could be brought into NATO, or that NATO would be disbanded. Instead, NATO expanded eastward toward Russia. So that's what he meant by a tragedy. And so the history of that period is somewhat similar to the way the Chinese look at the period from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, an era of shame, a disgrace, a destruction of the culture and the society. And so fortunately, despite all the slanders you hear about Russian culture and so on, the Russians have not responded in a nasty way. They've tried to work with the West. I listened to an interview yesterday with Polyansky, who's the deputy Russian UN ambassador. He was on the Tara Reid show, and he made a few comments. I just noted them down to give you a sense of what the Russians are actually saying. He said, nobody in Russia wants a nuclear war. He said, we know how destructive it would be. If somebody starts it, it won't be Russia. And we will only resort to nuclear weapons if our nation is threatened, if its existence is threatened. Then he said, we don't want to see the US crumble. We just want the US to stop playing the role of the world's policeman. He said, nobody told the US to be the world's policeman. The US still wants to keep that role. NATO is a threat to Russia, China, and others. So that's what the deputy ambassador to the UN said on an American talk show, which has been covered by absolutely no one. Instead, we keep hearing the twisting of Putin's words, where he said that if necessary, Russia will use all at its disposal to defend its nation, which is exactly what the US says in its nuclear posture review. Does that mean we're trying to start a nuclear war? Well, maybe it does.
Well, it's the old mutually assured destruction. And, that's, there's a whole show there from the Pugwash Conference and Bertrand Russell and all of that stuff. And we may have covered some of that before, but I want to get back to a couple of points. I just would like to know a little bit more about how did Al Gore get the brief to divide up all the goodies in Russia, and I suspect it might have something to do with his father's connection to Arm & Hammer. Anything on that?
You hit the nail on the head.
All right.
Arm & Hammer was one of the American oligarchs who was essentially told that if you work with the Soviets, you'll make a lot of money. Because the US had, on the one side, after the Russian Revolution, a total rebellion against the Russian Revolution. We actually sent some troops and backed up British troops that were there in the Civil War after the Revolution. But it was clear that they weren't going to win. And so, typical of these oligarchs, they had a second option, and that included have some people who were friendly to the Soviets, and Armand Hammer was one of them. And he was involved in oil, he was involved in minerals, lead, other kinds of things. And he was one of the patrons of Albert Gore Sr., who was a senator from Tennessee who was part of the World Federalist Movement. Now, Al Gore Jr. got that position because he was, at the time, Clinton's vice president, and because he was relatively knowledgeable about what was there in the Soviet Union and what was there afterwards. Now, also, Gore was a key ally of the Tony Blair faction in the United Kingdom, the so-called Third Way. It was Gore's Democratic Leadership Council which captured Clinton and said, you've got to have a third way, not liberals versus conservative, we've got to be in the middle, which was Tony Blair's policy. But what else was Tony Blair's policy? It was no more view of the Peace of Westphalia. We don't have the idea that we have to work for the improvement of our conditions by improving the other. We just have to assert our authority. And Gore was part of the Democrat movement that adapted itself to the idea of the unipolar world. The Democrats who became war hawks. Gore was one of the leaders of that. Gore was also one of the leaders of those who turned on the idea of Franklin Roosevelt. And if you look at Gore coming from Tennessee, Tennessee would have been a wasteland had it not been for the TVA that Franklin Roosevelt used to rebuild or to build that part of the country out of the Depression. Now, Gore went in with these British connections, with these Chase Manhattan and other connections, and Gore was the one who met with Viktor Chernomyrdin, who was the vice president of Russia. You know, Yeltsin, remember, was drunk most of the time. Yeltsin, at a certain point, was fairly weak. He was useful for the West when he stood up to the communists and made the coup to make sure Gorbachev was ousted. But the 96 election, it was Clinton Democratic Party activists who went in and ran the campaign to get Yeltsin reelected, and Gore was a part of that. Now, the Gore-Chernomyrdin Commission had the responsibility of figuring out what could be stolen from Russia in return for a little bit of credit. And this is what the other side of shock therapy was. As I mentioned, Jeffrey Sachs was saying, well, we should give them some credit, give them some money to rebuild. But his role is still, I think, it's necessary to investigate. I'm glad he's doing what he's doing now because he's emerged as a relative voice of sanity. But then he was part of the shock therapy policy, and I think he has some more atonement to do for that. But Gore was hardcore. Gore worked with Bob Strauss, who is known among Democrats as the king of thieves. And they literally went in and looked at Russian real estate, Russian land, Russian raw material deposits. This is the whole thing about the uranium question that's always brought up around Hillary. They had a good map of what was there in Russia and what could be stolen. And when Putin came in, Putin said, we're not going to do this anymore. So that's really the story of where Putin came from. He's a Russian nationalist. He's someone who says, we're not going to let you steal from us anymore. And he's oriented toward a traditional Russian Orthodox view, which is the old religion, which he and Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, and others contrast to what they call the post-Christian era in the West, referring to the gender issues and things of that sort. So the point about Gore is that he was one of the point men for figuring out what could be stolen from Russia. Now, you know who played that same role under Obama? Joe Biden. Biden was the point man for Ukraine. That's where the whole Burisma question comes in, and his son Hunter being sent in there to figure out what can be stolen in terms of oil, gas, raw material, the farmland. And now Zelensky, what's Zelensky doing? He's making an offer to Ukrainian farmers to overpay them for their farmland and then sell it privatize it, sell it to BlackRock, to Vanguard, to Archer Daniels Midland, the Cargill, the grain cartels, some of the most fertile land in the world. And then if the Ukrainian farmers who used to own it want to work, they'll become serfs for these grain cartel companies. So that's the continuation of the tradition of the Gore-Chernomyrdin Commission.
I had to smile because it just reminded me of what I was reading about the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which included parts of Ukraine, or maybe all of it from time to time,
Yeah.
was the last European government to give up serfdom. And there you are, return of serfdom, only in working for corporations instead of for nobility.
But John, on the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was actually Joseph II, the emperor during the time of the American Revolution, who moved against the oligarchy of his empire to grant freedom to the serfs. And one of the things that he did is he promoted Mozart, who wrote these wonderful operas like The Marriage of Figaro, which mocked the corruption of the nobility. And then even more so, Don Giovanni, because he was trying to communicate this idea that just because you're noble, you don't have a right to pillage and loot and rape. And that was the brief period where Joseph was very happy to promote Mozart, to the great anger of the oligarchy in the court. So that's a very interesting part of the cultural warfare of Europe. And Mozart, by the way, was a promoter of the idea of the American Revolution. One of his prominent patrons was Baron von Swieten, who was the person who brought Bach's music from Friedrich the Great's court to Austria and introduced it to the crowd around Haydn and Mozart. And von Swieten was part of what was called the American faction inside the Austrian nobility around Joseph II.
Well, I certainly do love my Mozart, and one of my favorite roles was the Commendatore in Don Giovanni. So I got to escort the old noble into hell, and
Don Giovanni.
Yeah, and it was a fun role. Getting back to well, you got me thinking about music, and I lost my train of thought. But the whole connection of I know what I was going to ask you. Well, if Gore was just another instrument of the deep state rape of Russia, what was Bush? It was Bush versus Gore, and it was this dramatic fight to the finish, and the hanging Chads, and the whole world was hanging by a Chad. What was that really all about? What was the issues really going on? Did George W. Bush have a better plan to rape Russia than Gore did?
No, it's what you have is different factions among the satanic networks. The neoliberals versus the old hardcore conservatives, those yearning for an oligarchic empire and those who want to have a more enlightened empire. Look, let me just come back to this through looking again at Bill Browder for a moment.
Yeah, tell us about him, because I don't remember who he is.
Well, Bill Browder was one of these guys who went, I think, with Goldman Sachs or Salomon Brothers, was one of the first people deployed into Russia after the shock therapy was carried out. And he came back with this fantastic report to the Salomon Brothers hierarchy. We can buy anything cheap. All we need is credit. And so they didn't believe him, but he finally got someone who gave him $200 million, and he turned it into something over $1 billion in a couple of weeks. And so the question is, where did this guy come from? His promoters were Robert Maxwell, you know him, very famous criminal,
Yeah, I heard
and
of him.
Edmund Safra of Republic Bank, who is another international money laundering criminal. They were the ones who basically taught Browder how to steal. And so Browder went in initially with Solomon Brothers. Then he set up his own company and was having fantastic turnover and profits. And at one point, he was supporting Putin because he saw Putin taking on the oligarchs. And Browder went to Harvard Club and gave a speech about how Putin's the great hero of Russia. And then the Russian security forces found out that his company, Hermitage, was stealing, that they weren't paying taxes. And so they went after Browder, and all of a sudden Browder came up with this line that Putin's a crook, he's an oligarch, he's a criminal. And he's the one whose accountant was a man named Sergei Magnitsky. Now, he claims Magnitsky was a lawyer, but there's no evidence that he was ever a lawyer. He was an accountant. And Browder let Magnitsky take the rap for his tax evasion. Magnitsky died in prison, and whether, Browder says he was brutally tortured and beaten. His family said he had an underlying condition. He wasn't treated well in prison, but he died. And Magnitsky became the poster boy for the so-called Magnitsky Act, which was the first major sanction policy against Russia. And Browder pushed it through the US Congress, he pushed it through the European Union, and it became the basis for many of the sanction policies that followed. So that's why Browder is important. Browder's still running around. He was just interviewed the other day saying, we've got to get rid of Putin no matter how many millions of people might die in the process. So this is the kind of guy you're dealing with, a self-promoting swindler. Alex in his book points out how often Browder makes up stories to make himself look better. Not so surprising. He's a typical con man. But he was hobnobbing with the aristocracy of Europe. And that's how he got the Congress to pass the Magnitsky Act, as well as the European Union to do that. So that's his importance.
Sounds like he's really important, but he's a con man, front man for. Is that right? Is he? In other words, do I think of him as a con man, as a independent agent that sometimes he's conning these guys and sometimes he's conning those guys, or is he a captive of something that's just so much bigger than him that he ultimately is a servant of them and not an independent agent? What do you think?
Well, I think his role model, personally, I think it was George Soros. Because Soros was from the same network. Soros was also involved in the plundering of Russia and Eastern Europe. And what do these guys think? They proclaim that they're looking out for the interests of the Russian people and they're looking out for the good of mankind, but somehow they end up as billionaires, and there's a lot of collateral damage that they've done. So, I tend not to take them at their word. Now, again, you look at the effect of this. What I would say people really should do in trying to figure this out is ask the question, was there an alternative to this radical so-called free market transition, privatization, austerity, death policy that was imposed? And there was. And that was associated with Lyndon LaRouche. Now, LaRouche in 1988 gave a press conference in Berlin where he said, the Berlin Wall will soon be coming down and Germany will be reunited. We need a program for the collapse of the communist bloc. And LaRouche proposed that you take the area between Paris, Berlin, and Vienna, which is one of the most advanced industrial areas in the world, at least at that time, and use the advanced rail systems that will be sort of spiral arms moving into the East Bloc and into Russia to move capital goods, because what LaRouche said is that Russia will need capital, not money, but technology, resources, infrastructure, and that the Russians can pay for it with the development of the resources they have, and then with the labor force they have will become a market for Western goods. And so he called this the European Triangle, and later it was extended to be the Eurasian Land Bridge, connect this through Central Asia to China. That was LaRouche's proposal. Now here's what's interesting. This gained the interest of leading figures in Germany, including Alfred Herrhausen, who is the chairman of Deutsche Bank. And Herrhausen was preparing a proposal for a major investment of credit in Russia, modeled on what was done after World War II to build Germany. It's the Marshall Plan, but more importantly, it was what Ludwig Erhard and Adenauer did to make the German economic miracle, which they had to do against the Americans around the Dulleses and others who said, no, we can't let Germany become a power again, unless it's as Nazis. Now, what Herrhausen proposed was very similar to what the LaRouches were proposing. But before he delivered the speech on this, he was murdered. And he was murdered by a non-existent terrorist group called at that time, the Red Army faction, Group 3, the third, the Baader Meinhof, and then the RAF, and then RAF 2. They also killed a man named Rohweder, who was in charge of what was called the Treuhand, or the trust, which was supposed to evaluate the properties in East Germany and in Eastern Europe, and what would be the credit allocations that could be generated against that. He was murdered by terrorists. And so you had the two leading spokesmen for an American system style or Marshall Plan style investment in Eastern Europe and Russia murdered. And what was the only other alternative that people were talking about? Thatcher, Bush, and Mitterrand, who said we can't let Germany become strong and we can't let Russia become strong. And so Kreiner, in his book, I just want to read you this quote because it's very insightful. He said, those in charge around Browder had a Cold War mindset. The objective was, quote, to defeat, dismember, and loot Russia, leave it so weakened and impoverished that it could never again challenge American hegemony, unquote. And I asked him in the interview, does that still persist in this grouping? And he said, I would say rather than a continuity, it's a continuing obsession of these people to destroy Russia in the interest of protecting the Pax Americana, the sole superpower idea. So I think that's why this is so important to look at this period and see that when Putin looks at the United States, what he sees is that he held out the hand in friendship. And he said, we'll get rid of the Warsaw Pact, we'll work with you on nuclear arms agreements, and let us become partners. And they said, oh, yeah, we want you for partners. But meanwhile, we're going to put NATO forces in Georgia, in Ukraine. We're going to foment discontent in Kazakhstan, in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and so on. So that's the world we live in. And the problem is the West does not have the resources today to impose its will as the sole superpower. And we're seeing that now in terms of Ukraine. The Ukrainian army has been decimated. Contrary to what you hear in the media about the Ukrainians have destroyed the Russian army, the Russian army that was sent into Ukraine was very small compared to the amount of land they were trying to essentially take over in order to demilitarize the Ukrainian military. So they're now building up the army. They're going to bring in more forces if necessary. The idea in the West was what? Well, Lloyd Austin said it. Let's do what we can to weaken Russia, to soften Russia, to create pain in Russia. Then you have John Bolton saying, no, we need regime change in Russia. So this is exactly what Kreiner was saying was the policy in the 90s. And it's not going to work because the Russians, if necessary, will continue to attack Ukrainian infrastructure. Life will be miserable for more and more Ukrainians. They're talking now about evacuating Kiev because the power situation is so bad. Well, did you think you could blow up the Kerch Bridge and blow up the Nord Stream pipelines and not get a response from Russia? Do you think you could shell the nuclear plant and claim that the Russians are doing it? So I think the Russians are playing hardball now. And if there's anything sensible that comes out of this election today, it will be a grouping of people in both parties who recognize the futility of sending Ukrainians to die to carry out the weakening of Russia, to allow the American hegemony to continue to dominate the world.
Yeah, I think about, the soldiers on both sides that don't need to die. And why? Well, one comment I saw yesterday was, well, if Zelensky were to negotiate, he'd be dead.
Yeah.
The people that control him would assassinate him immediately. So that's where he's at. But those people that control him, I don't know if it's the Azov army or if it's somebody who maybe a nameless oligarch behind the scenes that controls him, but certainly American intelligence and other, the Five Eyes and all of the other eyes out there would probably have a good sense of who's really running the show over there. You guys have some pretty good intelligence operations. What do you think is really where's the button that we can press that'll cause enough pain to somebody that they'll stop this war? What do you think?
Well, the oligarchs who are controlling it are essentially the leaders of NATO and the NATO countries.
Wow.
Zelensky look, the backing for Zelensky now is coming from the Azov battalion, the hardcore nationalists, Reznikov, the defense minister, Podolak, who's one of his top security advisors. But who do they answer to? Well, inside Ukraine, previously they answered to Kolomoisky, who was one of the richest oligarchs. But Kolomoisky had connections with Israel, with the Mossad, and he's now on the outs in terms of the control of Zelensky. Zelensky gets his marching orders from the West. Remember, he was prepared at the end of April to negotiate directly with Putin on a ceasefire, which would have included no Ukraine in NATO, no NATO membership for Ukraine, autonomy for the eastern provinces, and no Nazis in positions of influence in the government, and no weaponry from NATO on the border. He was prepared to do that. And Boris Johnson, in his last mission, was sent to Ukraine, to Kiev, to tell Zelensky, no, we'll give you more weapons, but you can't negotiate. Now, that wasn't from inside Ukraine. Now, also, if you look at the support of the Nazis in Ukraine, where does that come from? Well, at the end of World War II, it was the MI6 and the CIA who pulled Bandera and pulled Lebed. Lebed was brought to the United States. Bandera was brought to Germany, protected by the British. The same British networks and U.S. networks that protected the Nazi intelligence leader, whose name escapes me for the moment. Galen, yeah. So that's who controls them. The money is from the West. The arms are coming from the West. The marching orders are coming from the West. Is this in the interest of Ukraine? Well, not really. And the idea that we're sacrificing here in Germany, where we're going to be freezing and the industry is about to be shut down, for the freedom of the Ukrainian people? No, it's for the power of NATO to keep the United States as the sole superpower. But as I was saying, John, the West can't afford much more of this. We're running short of weapons. The stockpiles have been used up. They don't have the factories prepared to produce enough weapons to continue this war through the spring. And so I think we may see a face-saving gesture from the West. And I think if that happens, Putin would probably take it up. Then the question is, will they continue to keep armed forces as guerrilla warriors in Ukraine as a Gladio type stay behind force or not? So, this is, is there something to be hopeful about? Well, yes. Most of the rest of the world is rejecting this. Look, just one other thing I reported today that's really astounding. On last Saturday, the United Nations had a vote on a resolution to condemn the glorification of Nazism and neo-Nazism. This was aimed at the support for the Ukrainian Nazis, the fact that streets are being named after the Nazi-era collaborators like Bandera and so on, and that the U.S. is allowing the Azov Brigade to, not just allowing, but is depending on the Azov Brigade to put some spine into the Ukrainian defense forces. So the vote was 105 to 52 to support this resolution. Who opposed it? Who opposed the idea that you shouldn't glorify Nazi and Nazism? The United States, most of the NATO nations, they opposed this resolution. Now the rest of the world looks at that and says, well, wait a second. Didn't you guys fight Nazis in World War II? Weren't you siding with the Russians against the Nazis? Biden gives these talks about the threats from extremism in the United States and neo-Nazi right-wing forces, then sends $60 billion worth of arms to back up the Nazis in Ukraine. So, the United States is the big loser in this. And we're seeing a whole series of events in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Forum, the Organization of Islamic Countries, the Saudis, for example, where countries are now starting to say, we don't want to pick sides between the United States and Russia, but we're not going to support what the West is doing because we see Russia and China standing up for sovereignty. And this is, if we want to end this, it's not just a question of stopping the weapons flow into Ukraine. We have to adopt a different policy. And that means give up the idea of the Great Reset and the Green New Deal as defenses of a collapsing global system.
Well, midterm elections today in the United States. Some of my friends in Europe are putting hope in it. The idea that if the Republicans win the House, that this funding will dry up and the war will have to grind to a stop. You're in Germany and you keep an eye on what's going on popularly there. Are people saying that in Germany, that perhaps the Republicans will win and the war will come to an end because of the financing will stop? Is that something people are thinking, or is basically everybody still thinking Slava Ukraine?
Well, except for the crazy Greens, who are the real war hawks now. Most people would like to see the war end and would like to see something done to make sure that Germany has enough electricity for this winter and enough food. But they're not going to talk about it. So in a sense, they're hoping that the United States, that sane voices emerge in the United States and Western Europe. But there's now a big dispute going on between France and Germany. The European Union is in very big trouble right now. And I think that's another factor that people have to consider. In terms of the view of the war, I think most Germans would like this to be over, but they're not going to say it. And that's because they've been conditioned to believe that their security depends on the United States. And ironically, this was something that Donald Trump was attacking when he was critical of NATO in his first term in office, that NATO is dependent on the US nuclear umbrella and the US defense, the spending for NATO, and that this is a big mistake. So we'll see. Look, what Putin said, which I can quote without fear of being called a Putin mouthpiece, he said, there's a tremendous transformation occurring which is unstoppable in the world. And it's because the existing system is crumbling in front of us. The US and other countries can no longer pay down the debt. The inflation is wild. The policies that the Federal Reserve has chosen will not solve the problem. And so we look to the East, and what are they doing in the East? They're building rail systems, they're building power systems, they're building dams and water management systems. And what are we doing? We're just sitting here saying climate change is destroying the United States. Well, it's a bunch of bunk. Now you've got this COP20, whatever it is, in Egypt. I heard an interesting thing today. The president of Kenya said, we have the worst drought in East Africa in 40 years. Now, did anyone think to ask him, you mean there was a big drought 40 years ago? Was that because of carbon dioxide? Was that because of global warming? The whole narrative that we have to give up advances in science and technology to preserve the temperature on Earth is an absurd approach designed to reduce the world's population, the same way these oligarchs reduced the Russian population after the fall of communism. And I think the lesson here is that we'd better figure out real science and real statecraft before we end up in a nuclear war.
Well, I'd kind of like to leave it there. That's a very sound and resonant statement. I didn't get a chance to ask you one more question, if I may. What is China going to crumble now because the real estate market is crashing, and is Xi in trouble? Have you got a minute or two to give us your thoughts on that?
Yeah, quickly, a lot of people around Xi are sort of happy to see the real estate market crumble because it became a center of speculation. You know, the Chinese are trying to squeeze the speculation out of their banking system and finances rather than trying to bail it out. And that's the proper approach. That's what we used to do. That's called bankruptcy reorganization. So they may, for a short period of time, have a slower growth rate. But their overall policy is to continue to invest in wealth-producing enterprises, science and technology, taking breakthroughs in science, turning it into technology to improve the productivity of the workforce, and therefore an improved standard of living for a growing number of people. That's America. That's what we used to do. Instead, we gave the reins completely over to the private financial system, who control the Federal Reserve, and they've run it into the ground. And they're promoting that as the only model for the rest of the world. And the rest of the world isn't buying it. So, you know, we in the United States better wake up quickly.
All right, that's the last word for this morning from Harley Schlanger. Thank you so much, Harley and the LaRouche Organization and the Schiller Institute. And all the best. If you're in New York, you can vote for Diane Sayre, and I hope you will do that. She's making a great splash, and even if she doesn't win, the effort is really, really worth it. So,
by the way, the one poll that included her, she had 5.1% with absolutely no press coverage.
Excellent. All right, thanks everyone.